Thankful for the opportunity to speak for you this morning. This is the first installment of just a retooling of a series that I did at our old congregation in Memphis, where I went through and talked about all of the 7 I am statements that Jesus made in the book of John. This is the first one, of course. Comes from John chapter 6, where Jesus says that He is the bread of life. Now, I've written on the board just the title, and I've written physical signs and spiritual intent. What I want to do is take you through the book of John 6, but also see how it harmonizes with the other tellings of this gospel in Matthew chapter 14 and Mark 6. So that's why I've also have written on the board. I also want to notice that I've failed to put it up there because it's not there's not too much information that we take from Luke chapter 9, but in our introduction I will also refer to that. Just to paint the picture of where we are in the ministry of Jesus, this is immediately after John the Baptist has been killed. So I've taken a lot of this information out of a fourfold gospel that McGarver has put together along with some colleagues, and right before this, the feeding of the multitude in John chapter 6, also Jesus walking on water. Right before that occurrence, they have John the Baptist being killed. So John the Baptist is dead. Herod Antipas, who killed John, is terrified of a Jewish revolution, and he should be, because the Jews, once John was killed, once he was murdered, the Jews were ready to take control. They were ready to overthrow Herod. The disciples are ready for Jesus to finally establish his kingdom. They're ready for Jesus to take control of the situation, to avenge his friend's death. But we know that Jesus was not interested in the futile avengement or just getting revenge for his friend. And finally, Jesus withdraws from Galilee to rest and avoid the anticipation of his overthrow of the Roman rule. That's found in Matthew chapter 14, Mark chapter 6, and Luke chapter 9. Just a little bit about Jesus's avoidance of Herod. We know that Jesus wasn't afraid of Herod. We know that he wasn't scared. He knew that God was in control, but he avoided this situation just so he didn't have to deal with the Jews constantly antagonizing him about, when are we going to overthrow the Roman rule? When are you going to establish your kingdom? Because they thought his kingdom was going to be established on this earth. They thought his kingdom was to overthrow Herod's kingdom. But we know that's not the case. Jesus knows that the death of his friend John meant that the Jews would expect him to overthrow Herod's power. The Jews knew Jesus intended to establish a kingdom, and they sought to make him a king. And Jesus was going to set up a kingdom far different than they expected. Here the Jews think that, Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, but it's not. They when he mentioned kingdom, they thought, wow, we're going to finally get back on the map. We're finally going to retake our status as God's people and assert ourselves over this oppression. But we know that was not the case. Jesus had other intentions for his kingdom. The first section we want to talk about are physical signs. We want to talk about the signs that we read about in John chapter 6. The first one that we will come to is the feeding of the 5,000. So what I will do is we'll read the story, and there will be some points that we want to make to go along with it. Starting verse 1, John chapter 6. After these things, Jesus went over to the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude come toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?" This he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now, there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." Some things that we want to notice at the beginning, we notice that Christ, we want to make note that Christ noticed a crowd following him because of the signs that he performed. The signs were a way that Jesus would show his majesty, show the power, show that he was the Messiah and he was sent by God. That was his way of showing that he was from the Father. Because as we read throughout the New Testament, throughout Jesus' ministry, the Jews, they constantly sought signs. They constantly said, "Well, prove it, Jesus. Prove that you are from God." Well, he did. Because he knew that there would be no way that they would believe him by just his word. He knew that he would have to show them and prove that he had the power and that he was sent by God. Signs were intended to provide a miraculous physical blessing so that people may believe in him. It wasn't just to feed the multitude. He didn't just come to feed people, to heal the sick, to do good things for others. Lots of people today that don't have Christ do good things for others. They do what they can to help people. Jesus came and he did these things, but not just for that purpose. He did these things, these miraculous things, so that people might believe in him. Signs were void of any physical or logical explanation. There's just so there would be no confusion for how these things transpired. There would be no logical reasoning that, well, Jesus was able to do this because of X or Y or Z. The reason there's no physical or logical explanation, so there should be no mistake for the source of Christ's power. It also notes that Matthew, in his account, noted that Christ had compassion on them. And Mark also writes that because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. He had compassion on these people because it looked like they were wandering around, possibly spiritually, most likely spiritually, but also they were traveling in a multitude. It is apparent they were looking for something. They were looking for something. They were looking for food, maybe answers, maybe meaning, maybe guidance. But Mark's remark that they were like a sheep without a shepherd notes that they were looking for something. They weren't complete. They were longing for something different. Now the Passover was at hand, as John remarks. There were many people like this traveling during the time without food, possibly on a spiritual or a religious high, like we're going to Jerusalem, we're going to the feast, to the Passover, to remember when God removed the wrath from our ancestors, when God passed over, when he inflicted the great plague upon the Egyptians. They were most likely on a religious high. They were excited. They were going to Jerusalem. It was time to feast. It was time to remember God. They were likely excited about the Passover, and they were looking. The scholars say that people like this would often travel outside of their routes, off the road, if they heard of a prophet being there or somebody practicing miraculous signs. They would often go and see those people because it was worth something to see. We want to also note that Christ fed them spiritually. It's not recorded in this version, but in Luke in Mark chapter 6, Christ taught them many things. And Luke said he spoke about the kingdom of God. Now, there was already excitement about the kingdom that Jesus was talking about, but there was the misconception of what Christ meant. Jesus continued to heal their sick, as Matthew notes, so that more people would believe his teaching. So the excitement of the kingdom did not detract Christ from still performing these things, but he did these things so he can prove that he had the power of God and that they might believe. John notes that Jesus took care of their physical needs, but in the other accounts, they also mentioned that he took care of their spiritual needs. We note that Christ fed them spiritually. Being in a deserted place, the multitude had no access to shelter or food as they journeyed to Jerusalem, which I went and looked the modern routes. I tried to do my best Google Map research to see what it would be like walking from Tiberias to Jerusalem. In modern day, it would be about 93 miles straight south. Of course, when they were passing through there, they probably traveled even further distance to get there to Tiberias, where Jesus was. But we noticed that that journey likely means that they had no food, no shelter, nothing. And when Jesus had finished teaching them, that there was no longer any way for them to go find provisions. There was no way for them to go into the city and find food or find shelter, as we'll note later. Now, Christ knew exactly what he planned to do, as John states. Christ knew exactly what he was going to do. But he wanted to test his disciples to see if they believe that Christ can do something about this. He revealed weakness in his disciples' hearts, but he didn't do it for shame. He didn't reveal this weakness so the disciples would feel inadequate. He revealed these weaknesses to show his power to them. He revealed those weaknesses that since they didn't believe, that they were thinking, oh, well, how in the world are we going to feed all of these people? How are we going to buy enough bread to feed all these people? What are these 5 barley loaves and 2 fish to this number of people? But this weakness that they had, they just didn't. I guess they just didn't occur to them that Jesus was able to accomplish these things. But Jesus wasn't there to shame them into believing. He wanted to show them another sign that they could actually believe. I want to make notice, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:9 that God's power is made perfect in weakness. So Jesus is not necessarily alluding to that verse, I'm sure that's not what he was trying to show, but he was showing the power through their weakness. He was showing that because they didn't think that they could feed enough people, Jesus was going to take care of it. By organizing the people on the grass, Jesus removed much labor from the disciples in distributing the food. He ensured that each person got their fill, that he affirmed that the reality of the miracle could not be questioned. And he ascertained how many people were actually fed. By doing all of this, Jesus made sure that there was no other explanation other than this is a powerful work, a miracle performed by Jesus. And finally, we want to note that Christ cared for the physical needs for a spiritual purpose. Each disciple received a personal leftover basket. That's amazing when you think about it, is when they thought that there wasn't enough to feed this multitude, but each one of them got their own to-go box to go with it. Like, that's amazing. And it shows just how Christ takes care of those people who do what he asks. Christ takes care of his disciples who do his work. And it showed that he had the power to miraculously care for them. The multitude believed in the physical healing and provisional power. They believed that this man can feed us with nothing. Like, this man can feed us, he can heal us, he can cure us, but they still did not believe the spiritual power. They still didn't grasp that, maybe we need to believe in Christ on a deeper level. They were still just after, if we follow Jesus around, he can heal us, he can feed us, he can do all of these physical things for us. But they neglected the spiritual part of the miracle. Of course, continuing on in John chapter 6, we'll notice, I want to just read this first verse. Verse 15. Therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. I want to make this note that we're getting into this other sign, this other physical sign that Jesus gave about in regards to him walking on water. But I wanted to make this note before. Jesus was withdrawing to begin with once he saw the multitude approaching him. Like, it wasn't that he was waiting on the multitude to get there. He was going to take care of himself. He was going to withdraw to the east of Galilee, to avoiding everyone else so he could take care of his own personal needs. It's one of the few glimpses that we get of Jesus expressing his pure humanness. We see another example later in John chapter 11, when he's dealing with the Lazarus situation, and all the people grieving Lazarus, it turned him. It made him groan in his spirit. He growled almost about the havoc that death wreaks on us. It disturbed him. It made him sorrowful. This is just a glimpse of what it's like to be God in a human body. During this time, Jesus wasn't just resting, but he was praying. And as we noted, that he tried to withdraw immediately upon hearing the news of John the Baptist's death, but the multitude delayed him. The news of John the Baptist's murder was intended to exasperate Jesus, so that maybe he would get tripped up, maybe he would speak out of the will of God, maybe he would do something rash. So instead of giving in to whatever desires or whatever anger that Jesus had, Jesus even saw the necessity of going to withdraw so he might be able to subdue any sinful reactions. Because Jesus felt the same feelings that we feel today. If our best friend just is murdered for nothing, we would be pretty furious. We would react in a way most likely that is that's not like Christ. But Christ showed that he still feels he felt those feelings that we feel, and he still had to take time to himself to withdraw. Let's go on to Jesus walking on the sea. Starting in verse 16. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into the boats and went over the sea towards Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. Just a very odd place for the story of Jesus walking on the sea. Here we have Jesus giving bread to the multitude of people, and on the other side we're going to read about Jesus talking about the bread from heaven. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of this section, we have an oddly placed story of Jesus walking on the sea. And it's an odd ending to it. Jesus walked on the water. They were afraid. He said, "Do not be afraid." And they heard his voice and they were comforted. So they got him into the boat and immediately they were there. And that's it. That's all John writes about in this story. Now, we can piece together a few other details about this story from same chapters, Matthew 14 and Mark 6. There are 3 things that Jesus did that we want to notice. Is that we already talked about he withdrew, Jesus walked, and Jesus waited. Let's talk about Jesus walking on the water. This is one of the most famous of Christ's signs. People refer to it every day. It's all in pop culture. It's all in poetry, literature, everything. Jesus walking on water, because it's the most indisputable miracle that we can find. Like, there's no logic, no miracle that Jesus performed had any logical explanation that was scientific or any physical explanation. But nobody attempts to try to justify how Jesus walked on the water. Nobody tries to talk about how the molecules of the water formed together and they created some kind of thing where it was like pavement. No, nobody does that because they take it at face value. This is also one that was a private sign for the disciples that we'll note later. Even the disciples needed a sign to strengthen their belief. Often people mistakenly try to speculate how the physics of Christ's signs happen. It's ironic how I never hear people trying to just explain how Jesus walked on water, but I hear people speculating of how he fed the multitude. Maybe the food regenerated itself. Maybe the point is that such a reaction to a sign from Jesus detracts from the majesty and the glory of God. If we try to reason our way into believing these signs as these people did, as the Pharisees did, we detract from the glory that it shows. If we just let it be that, God's glory and majesty and power can shine through that sign, and people can believe. Also, this is a note that McGarvey put in his book, that there was no mistaking the voice of Jesus. When the disciples were terrified, they couldn't see, The wind was literally blowing in the direction where they were going. They were going into the wind. And they saw this figure. I'm not sure if it was a silhouette or what. They saw a figure walking on the water. They were terrified. All Jesus had to say was, "It is I, do not be afraid." And they immediately knew who Jesus was. They immediately knew it was Jesus. And it brought great assurance to the disciples. Of course, now Peter, being bold, being the guy that's ready to go leap into danger, ready to go at it, ready to do something, be active, impress Jesus, says, "Lord, if it is you, get me to come out and walk to you." Now, this is consistent with the character of Peter. We know that he is willing to take a rash act of bravery all the time, but he usually lacked the steadfastness to complete the act. Jesus presented this foundational Christian belief that one can do anything with faith. He explicitly says this later in Matthew 17 and 20 by saying, "If you have faith of the small mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move." This is the foundational statement of faith, the belief that we have that if we have faith, we can do anything through Christ. This was the standard of faith for Peter to successfully complete his walk to Christ. And it was certainly possible. We think that, well, it's impossible. Jesus did the impossible by walking on water. Well, Peter also walked on water for a little bit. So it's not impossible for Peter to have done that, but he let his faith fail. This is how Jesus takes care of us, though. Just as Jesus still brought Peter to him when his faith failed, and he said, "Oh, ye little faith." He criticized Peter for not having enough faith. He didn't leave Peter there, though. He didn't leave Peter there to sink. He still brought Peter with him. He still meets us to the point where our faith ends. Jesus still is there to meet us, to bring us out of our unbelief, as the centurion in Mark 9 mentioned that please help my unbelief. I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus is still there to bring us out where our faith fails. Now, going back to the point that I made earlier about how this was a private sign, even the disciples needed a sign to strengthen their belief. Mark says that the disciples showed hardness in their hearts following the feeding of the multitude. Now, there was the expectation that they saw Jesus did this. They knew that Jesus had the power. They should have worshipped him then and there, but it said in Mark that their hearts were hardened. They didn't understand. They didn't realize that this was such a miraculous event and it showed the glory of God. Instead of Jesus rebuking them and saying, "Why didn't you worship me after seeing these things?" He gave them another sign. He gave them another sign to show that he had this power, and then it says that they rejoiced in that miraculous power. We want to note, to summarize, the physical signs coming from the feeding of the multitude and Jesus walking on water, that Jesus provided physical sustenance, the physical food. He provided physical comfort by calming the sea for the spiritual purpose of strengthening belief, for the spiritual purpose of making people believe and strengthening the disciples' faith. Now, we move on to the circumstances leading up to our title for the day, the bread of life. Let's go continue on reading, starting at verse 22, John chapter 6. On the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except the one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. However, other boats came to Tiberias, near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. And they found him on the other side of the sea, and they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Jesus answered them and said, Most assuredly I say to you, that you do not seek me because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has sent his seal on him. Then they said to him, What shall we do that we may work the works of God? Jesus answered and said to them, This is the work of God, that you believe in whom he has sent. I want to stop there and notice a couple of things. The first point, Jesus taught that we are to work for spiritual food, not for physical food. Jesus perceived in their hearts that they were after the physical blessings from his signs, not the signs himself. They were after what they got out of the sign, not the belief in the person performing the sign. They were after what they could get out of Jesus rather than Jesus himself. Jesus called out their desire for him to be an earthly king to meet their physical needs and set up an earthly kingdom. Jesus wasn't precious to them. He wasn't divine. They weren't seeking him. He was just useful. He was useful in meeting their physical needs. And he tells them to labor for the food that endures to eternal life. This is the crux of our point, is that we get these physical signs, we get the physical blessings that Jesus gives. He gave to them, and we still get our physical blessings, but it's for a spiritual purpose. We are giving these blessings so that we might seek the person, the blesser rather than the blessing. Seek the giver instead of the gift. We are to labor for the food that is spiritual, that is everlasting, rather than the physical food of this life. Verse 30. Therefore they said to him, What sign will you perform them, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said to them, Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I say to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. A point that I meant to make before we finished the scripture is that they were asking how to attain spiritual food. Jesus told them to believe in the one that he has sent, which is the cornerstone of our faith. This trend of question and answering in this discourse about being the bread of life, it parallels the woman at the well, the story of the woman at the well in John chapter 4, but it has a different conclusion. Jesus tells her that he gives water that is everlasting, that will lead to eternal life. He compared life to water, but here he compares life to bread. The woman ended up believing and proclaiming the good news about Jesus Christ to all the people in Samaria, but the Jews did not. They did not believe. If the story of Moses and manna was lost through the generations because they are misplacing the glory. They were glorifying Moses for giving them bread, but they lost the part where it was God that was actually providing the bread for them. If they believed that God gave their ancestors manna, perhaps they would be more willing to accept the spiritual bread that Jesus offered. And then they told Jesus, evermore give this bread. They still focused on the physicalness of bread. They still were focusing on what physical bread was. They wanted to get the bread that tasted better than they said tasted in to their ancestors. They certainly remembered the insufficiency that the manna had for their ancestors. They complained about the manna. Their ancestor complained about the bread, the manna that came down from heaven, that it didn't taste good enough. They could have eaten all the good food back in Egypt and not have to deal with all of this. They remembered the insufficiency, both in taste and in physical sustenance. They asked for better bread than the manna that they got, their ancestors got, but God is offering better bread. And we find that on verse 35. He offers Jesus as the bread of life. We want to note that Jesus is the life-giving bread that sustains our souls. Jesus is the spiritual food that we should work for. But Jesus didn't only come to give bread, to give all of these physical blessings. He came to be the bread. He gave us all of these things. He still gives us all of these things so that we might continue to believe in Him and seek Him. The most appropriate logical explanation that can be given for the feeding of the multitude was that the multitude was fed because Jesus was the source of the bread. Both physically, but more importantly, spiritually. The only explanation is that they were only able to be fed because Jesus was the source of the bread and He was or is the bread. The Jews refused to believe because their hearts were hardened, and Jesus did not satisfy their desire for a physical bread. So as we look upon this story of the feeding of the multitude, walking on the water, and Jesus teaching that He is the bread of life, we want to ask ourselves, are we focused on the physical blessings that we receive more than the spiritual blessings? Are we seeking after what we can get? Are we more worried about what we have or what we need physically than what we do spiritually? Are we working more for the physical food or the spiritual food? That's kind of hard for me because I like to eat. I like to eat a lot. And working for the spiritual food that Jesus offers, making sure that we are living a life that is pleasing to Him, tasting and seeing that Christ is good, is more important than what we physically can have on this earth. And finally, is Jesus the primary source of life for us? Are we living for Christ? Are we living to ensure that we will be able to receive His reward that He gives us from His perfect life? Or are we worried about everything that we have going on in here? Do we seek life in our daily physical life, or do we seek Christ to be our primary source of life?